This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review with Gilad Halpern.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to the word, to the thought and to debate, brought to you by the Van Leer Jerusalem Institute, which promotes humanistic, democratic and liberal values in the social discourse in Israel. I'm your host Gilad Halpern, and every week I'll be engaging in close encounters of the intellectual kind with writers and scholars, or simply people of ideas, of all types and vocations, who have done something to make our lives a tad more interesting. My guest today is a Professor Emeritus of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, Vice President of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, and also the editor of a newly published collection of essays dedicated to Chaim Weizmann, the first president of the State of Israel, as well as the president of the World Zionist Organization throughout much of the pre-state years. At the same time, Weizmann was an illustrious scientist who laid the foundations to the establishment of the Hebrew University and the Institute of Science in Rehovot that would later bear his name. The publication that we're here to discuss today explores Weizmann's two hats, the statesman and the scientist. Professor Benjamin Kedar, hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review.
Thank you.
So there are few scientists who have ventured into politics. Margaret Thatcher comes to mind. Angela Merkel is another example. But even when they do, the practice of one comes at the expense of the other. But in Weizmann's case, for about half a century, he was a full-time statesman as well as a full-time chemist. He's pretty unique in this sense, isn't he?
Indeed he is. And I think that one reason that he was able to do so was that he was a statesman without a state. And that means that even though he was engaged in politics, he could and wanted to engage in science. But the truth is that he was not a scientist all along. There was a hiatus in his scientific activities, say between 1917 and 1931.
During which time he dedicated his work mainly to the Zionist cause?
Exactly.
And Weizmann is credited to a large degree with the Balfour Declaration that gave way to the British mandate of Palestine and in many ways led to the creation of the State of Israel. His presence in the United Kingdom during the First World War and in the period during which the Balfour Declaration was made opened doors for him in the British government. Can you tell us a bit about how Weizmann rose to prominence in the UK to the extent that it allowed for him to get this charter from Prime Minister Lloyd George and Minister Arthur Balfour?
Well, Weizmann was working for the British and as a scientist, as a chemist, and he made major contributions to the war effort during World War I. And as such, in this capacity, he made the personal acquaintance of Lloyd George. He knew Balfour even earlier. And this helped him, this paved the way also for his Zionist activities. That is, he was considered up to a point as a member, outside member, if you wish, of the British establishment.
What was his contribution to the British war effort in the First World War?
Well, that was the invention of a new method of producing acetone, which was so important for the war industry.
He was a professor at Manchester at the time.
He was not a professor. He failed to become a professor, but he worked there. He never obtained the rank of a professor, and this irked him a lot. He really became professor only at what became later on the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot.
Mm-hmm. And would you say, is there any grounds to believe that the Balfour Declaration was given to him as some kind of recognition for his contribution to the British war effort?
Well, this is the very popular conception of it. And Lloyd George was Prime Minister at the time, as you mentioned, actually said so in so many words. I decided to allow him to have a say in the matters of Palestine as recognition for his work for the British Empire. But this is far-fetched, and Weizmann never accepted that. This is a very popular view of it. You find it in the literature. It was actually stated even before the Balfour Declaration, as I could show in one of my articles in the collection you mentioned. But it is certainly far-fetched. And what really happened was that because of his connections with these people, they lent their ear also to his political aspirations.
For him, he said that being a statesman and being a scientist is like worshipping two gods at the same time. Did he himself see any contradiction between these two vocations?
It was not so much a contradiction as it was a tension. That is, there were periods when he was engaged too much, as he saw it, in politics and neglected science, and then he tried to compensate by concentrating on science, but he never was able to serve, as you say, just one of those idols. It was a constant tension, and he mentions it all along in his autobiography and in other writings.
But he did say that they are mutually complementary at the same time. He didn't see them as two separate realms at the end of the day. For him, being a scientist, in a way, served his political aspirations and vice versa.
Undoubtedly. I think that his stature as a statesman owed a lot to the fact that he was a scientist, and he was able to persuade, for instance, the Anglo-American Committee in 1946, just because he approached the problems of Zionism as a scientist. That is, he didn't say, like other Zionist leaders, we must have this is going to happen. He would chart the entire scene and say these factors tend to this direction, these to another direction. And that made an immense impression on the members of the committee.
That he treated the question soberly and objectively, as it were?
Exactly, yes.
And did he see this as coming from his scientific vocation?
Undoubtedly. You see it in the speeches on various occasions where he says, I, as a scientist, tell you that we should approach this problem gradually, or I, as a scientist, tell you that you have to try maybe 100 times before you attain a positive result, and so on and so forth.
Another thing that he was very much involved in was the establishment of the Hebrew University and later on the Weizmann Institute. That wasn't called the Weizmann Institute initially, but he was very much involved in laying the foundation to an academic and scientific committee in Palestine and later Israel. What can you tell us about that? The initial idea to establish a Hebrew university came as early as 1913, where there was really virtually nothing in the Jewish Yishuv here. The Zionist enterprise was really making its very first steps. Even earlier, in 1902, Weizmann, Martin Buber, published a booklet called A Jewish University, eine jüdische Hochschule, which was printed in 1902 in Berlin, and that was the blueprint for a Jewish university. At that stage, he was not sure that it must be in Jerusalem or in Palestine, but the idea was there that the Zionist organization must support the idea of university, and Herzl accepted that. And then he worked on it, and as you say, in 1913, the plan became more concrete, and here he speaks already about Jerusalem as the place, and then, of course, we have the foundation stones laid in 1918, and the university inaugurated in 1925. Was it frowned upon in any way, the fact that before there any foundations of a Jewish settlement in Palestine, they were talking about creating an ivory tower?
Yes, there were people who said it's too early, we should emphasize the building of an infrastructure, villages, towns, and only later on, and there was a fear of too much emphasis on the intellectual side. But Weizmann said, we Jews always considered school, scholars as being central, and therefore we must start with university. And he prevailed.
Mm-hmm. There's something about Weizmann, the fact that he was an intellectual, a cosmopolitan. He lived in many countries around Europe. He was originally from Eastern Europe, but then followed his studies in Germany and later Switzerland and the UK. He spoke quite a few languages. And until the establishment of Israel, he never really lived in Palestine. How did he manage to stay on top of the leading Zionist endeavor, of being really at the forefront of the Zionist enterprise, of the Zionist leadership, despite all those things that really should be a disadvantage to this end?
Well, he was, of course, a highly intelligent person, and his personal charm was overwhelming. You see it from the reactions of very many people, that he was not a great speaker, by the way, but he was a great conversationalist, and he was able to persuade people on the personal level of his ideas. For instance, his first meeting with Balfour.
Yes.
And then he was independent in his activities. That is, the entire attainment of the Balfour Declaration was done without the approval of the Central Zionist Organization, because the Central Zionist Organization wanted to be neutral between Britain and Germany.
Yes.
And he did it on his own. And later on, perhaps even more importantly than the Balfour Declaration itself, he, at the peace conference after the war, was able to introduce the essence of or even the wording of the Balfour Declaration into the resolutions of the victors. And as Shlomo Avineri in our book shows it, this was probably a more important achievement than the Balfour Declaration itself.
Mm-hmm. So basically he knew how to follow up on the diplomatic endeavors even after the Balfour Declaration.
Yeah, exactly.
The fact that he prevailed as a leader was not by some sort of, credit that was given to him for achieving the Balfour Declaration. He knew constantly how to reinvent himself politically.
He became leader because of his achievements, and that catapulted him into the position of the president of the Zionist Organization. Mm-hmm. And, well, there were ups and downs in his leadership, but as for Palestine, he built his home in Rehovot, not far from Tel Aviv, already in the mid-30s. Mm-hmm. So he had a permanent base here, but he was always on the move and yes. Lived, as you say, most of the time in Britain, and during World War II mm-hmm. also in the United States.
Mm-hmm. But also he suffered some sort of political blow towards the end of his life when he was ousted from the leadership of the Zionist Organization by Ben-Gurion, and was later given the very prominent but ceremonial role of the president of the State of Israel. Can you tell us a bit about his later life in politics, and how did he personally react to these developments?
Well, the common view is that Weizmann was pro-British, and that Ben-Gurion understood that the United States is the new power, and that's where the future of Zionism should look to. But when you study the documents more closely, you see that Weizmann too understood the growing role of the United States, and he made very important connections there. And after all, it was he who persuaded President Truman at a crucial moment to support the United Nations Partition Resolution, and also many other things, like recognizing Israel a few minutes after Ben-Gurion declared the independence in Tel Aviv.
And
I think that in a sense, the view that he was a man of the past and Ben-Gurion was the man of the present and the future is not correct. Ben-Gurion positioned himself in that role, but Weizmann basically understood what the importance of the United States versus Britain is.
Was he disgruntled at all by his removal from the leadership position?
Quite so. He said several times he describes himself as the prisoner in Rehovot, and that he had no influence at all at what was happening, and he was not so much disgruntled but quite unhappy with this role. But he was also ill at the time. He died in 52, as you know, yes. And so his physical powers were declining.
He engaged in scientific research almost until his dying day, and he saw that kind of chemical research that he was undertaking as also serving the Zionist cause. Can you tell us a bit about that, how he saw his research as the foundation stone to the Zionist cause in those late years?
All along he thought that science has a very important role in building the national home, as it is called in the Balfour Declaration, and later in the establishment of Israel. That is possibility to mobilize science, for instance, to discover new sources of energy, to make the world, not only Israel, less dependent on oil. Yes. So this was one of his many new ideas. And what I found as editor of this book was that there is a lot in the manuscripts of his autobiography which deals with these questions, and it was not included in the printed version for several reasons. So what we really need is a critical edition of Weizmann's autobiography with all the variants and with all those texts that didn't go into the final version.
Mm-hmm. Can you tell us a bit about what was really left out of the autobiography that was actually incidentally called Trial and Error, just to prove our point
exactly,
that he was a scientist as well as a statesman and vice versa?
Exactly. And the Hebrew translation of Trial and Error misses the point entirely, and you don't understand that he's speaking about science. Now, I always knew that he left out a chapter where he discusses his relationship with Ben-Gurion during those tense years in America when Ben-Gurion tried to oust him, and this was well known. So when I came to the Weizmann
we were talking about the immediate aftermath of this?
During the war.
Yes.
Okay. There was a very tense meeting of Ben-Gurion and Weizmann with the Zionist leadership in America, where Ben-Gurion accused Weizmann of doing everything on his own without consulting with other Zionist leaders and so on, and Weizmann answered. So he omitted this chapter. But so I asked to see it, and when I saw the manuscript, I suddenly saw that there are very many other parts that were omitted. And perhaps the most interesting is the description of a meeting Weizmann had with Fritz Haber, a leading German chemist of Jewish origin, a few months before Hitler rose to power. And Weizmann says that he told Haber, after Haber showed him his immense institute in Berlin, he told me, look, it's a fantastic establishment, but wherever I went, the chief of the department was Jewish, the second in command was Jewish, the third in command was Jewish, and only at the bottom there were Germans. And he said, this can't go on like this. This is going to explode one day. And Haber tells him, Dr. Weizmann, you shouldn't say such things. You are talking like an anti-Semite. And a few months later, Hitler rose to power.
And the rest is history, as they say.
Yes.
And I'm afraid this is all we have time for today. So Professor Benjamin Kedar, Professor Emeritus of History at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, as well as former Vice President of the Israeli Academy of Sciences and Humanities, thank you very much for coming in today and talking to us about your recently published collection of essays dedicated to Chaim Weizmann, the statesman and the scientist. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That brings us to the end of our show today. Thank you very much for listening. Also, big thanks to Alex Benish, the technical producer of this show. I'm Gilad Halpern, signing off here in Tel Aviv. Do join us again next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review. And until then, goodbye.
Friendship.